2022 actually started off, people can remember, on a positive note. We were actually seeing the Chinese economy rebound from what was a mild slowdown at the end of 21. And you were especially seeing the services side of the economy and consumption side of the economy finally rebound. And things were looking really good till you had the Omicron outbreak hit China. And then you saw that the government, starting really from the spring, really from March onwards, starts to get really nervous and shuts down eventually Shanghai. And then you have Beijing go down into a de facto lockdown. And what you get over after that, over the late spring, summer, through the fall, and then through, till up until end of November, is a repeated series of lockdowns under the so-called zero COVID policy that had existed in China for, the year or so prior to that. And all that good news and upbeat sentiment that you were seeing in January and February after the opening of 2022 just dissipated. And what you got was one of, just a successive weakening of the Chinese economy quarter after quarter, or sometimes month after month. And the year just became one of the worst on record that we have had inside of China, outside of the early 2020 slowdown that you saw when COVID first hit. So 2022 being from potentially a positive year from the Chinese economy to being, as I said, one of the worst. What happened at the end of 22, of course, is that we got the about face from Xi, essentially, right up top, right? We went from having zero COVID to essentially having total COVID, scrapping off all lockdowns and restrictions. And then, of course, you saw just the eruption of coronavirus cases throughout the country, especially in the bigger cities. And then, it's, of course, as predicted, it spread to the rural areas, especially during the Lunar New Year holidays as they were starting to take place. Now, the expectation once zero COVID was scrapped was that you were going to get a bombastic recovery in 2023. A lot of the people positioned, as a matter of fact, markets positioned to say, look, you're going to get revenge spending in China. You're already seeing a property sector easing going on. And that's going to essentially be a property sector bailout. And the government will probably come in with additional stimulus. So there was you're talking about oil price targets, for example, coming out at over $100. This is what I call sort of the mega bull thesis on China that came about at the end of the year. Now, come to January, and you see that big spike in consumer spending. You see the travel and hospitality gauges just skyrocket. Manufacturing wasn't doing so well right at the beginning. Taking that story forward into February, what happens? This was the key month in order to understand, look, are you really getting that revenge spending surge and from here onwards it's all take off? Or is this going to be in fits and start till the consumers feel more confident? And the data suggests that it is not a upward trajectory story. Consumer spending, especially on travel and hospitality, etc., pulled back. Consumers have pared back a little bit. However, on the positive side of the story, you are getting a manufacturing sector that is doing a little bit better. And I think very, very importantly, you're finally starting to get a sense that the property market is turning a corner. Compared to the absolute horrors of 2022, especially late last year, you're finally starting to get a bit of a recovery in the market. The year-over-year picture is still grim, and I think it'll take a second for that to turn around. But nevertheless, I think that's a positive story. So as you said, you are getting currently that tales of two China thing going on. The whole thesis that there's going to be revenge spending rests on this idea that during the pandemic, Chinese households have accumulated a mountain of savings. And as soon as they're given the opportunity to spend, they are going to go out there and spend. Now, that I think is very, very wrong-headed and certainly misleading. And it's important to understand that the savings that sit there in the bank accounts, regardless of how high the number is, and there's no consensus on that either, it's coming from the fact that people are saving for a rainy day. The macroeconomic conditions have been so bad that saving your money is the smart thing to do. It's not just the lack of opportunity to spend. The other reasons I think you've seen, especially among the wealthy, which is where the savings have jumped, is that property is typically the place where people put their money. But property is no longer a reliable investment asset class. And so the money that was intended to go there is currently just sitting in savings accounts. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to take the money that is intended to grow their wealth and just go buy an expensive handbag with it or go take a trip to Paris or Florence. So those are two things I think I want to caution right up front. Coming to your very specific question, why is it that consumers have pared back activity? I think some of it is certainly seasonal. What you got was a bump that was driven exclusively by the Lunar New Year. And now that people are back to their cities, they're either looking for jobs or they're back at work. Some of that is going to die down till, of course, you get into maybe the late spring or the early summer. But a broader context is always important. The labor market in China still remains significantly weak, right? There's a very serious employment problem that's going on there right now. And I think that by and large will continue to constrain, even along the way as you get better consumer spending results, will probably put some downward effect on the overall state of the Chinese consumer. The Chinese banking system, outside of some private banks that you have, is by and large a non-commercial financial system. In other words, whereas the big players here are what we commonly refer to on the investment banking side as Wall Street, or on the commercial side, of course, you've got all the major banks that we're familiar with, whether it be Bank of America or JP Morgan or Citibank or other international banks that also operate in U.S. territories or worldwide, really. You have those as the core players. You don't have really government-owned banks that have, and right, it's not like the Federal Reserve, for example, has bank branches out there which lend to businesses or lend to households. In China, of course, the reverse is true. The biggest banks, the big five they used to be, now they're the big six or big seven even, are all government-owned banks, whether it be the Bank of China, the ICBC, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the lending structure there is very tightly within the hands of the state, which means that the policymakers in China, have the ability at the national level and at the provincial level to exercise that type of political control and decide they can most certainly decide the winners and losers that way by saying you must lend to this particular industry or these particular firms, right? So historically, what have you seen? Large companies are some of the biggest beneficiaries of credit. Large companies oftentimes also happen to be state-owned companies. So state-owned companies have also been biggest beneficiaries of either cheap access to credit or very easy access to credit, however you might want to put it. Oftentimes, for example, you'll see that SMEs, and it's because especially they happen to be private companies, struggle to get access to credit in the same manner that large firms do. Because there is a very clear idea that, look, you can lend. Now I'm deviating a bit, but this is an important point for the audience that, a state-owned company and a large company, you give them the credit, it is going to be backed by the government. If there's a default, there will ultimately be a process through which the bank's books will be cleaned out, as we kind of just saw happen in the case of all the defaults that you saw in the property market, right? There's this ongoing game of how money moves around in the Chinese financial system, but the state ultimately backs up these state-owned companies. Or oftentimes these large companies. SMEs don't have that, and SMEs will often find themselves, unfortunately, therefore, in the back of the line when it comes time to access credit. But that's a big chunk of it, and it's related to another point, by the way, for the audience to understand. When you get things like big defaults in China, you'll often hear, or the risk of defaults in China, you'll often hear people out in the West and the United States say, this is the Lehman moment. When Evergrande happened, everybody said this is the Lehman moment. In China, it's a different story because the government owns the banks. The government has, for better or for worse, normally for the worse, the ability to socialize the losses, just step in and do the bailout. It's not like here where the sitting Treasury Secretary has to get all the major banks around a table and then beg them to take care of the problem and then try to work out a deal. It doesn't work that way there. The party directly controls the financial infrastructure that way.